political scientist, where ideas of culture, identity, sexuality, identity all become very important in his work. So we're going to talk about the title that they've given us is Arabic Identity in Contemporary Times. So I'm going to ask, Joseph, I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit about this notion of an Arab identity. Is it, is it Arab nationalism of the 60s, 50s and 60s? The Arab Spring became an identity. We were talking earlier, and you said, the Arab sense of identity in a pre-modern time wouldn't be called an identity as such. Might even go to Andalusia, might even go to a broader context of what it meant to be, outside of the Arab world as such. So the Arab world, the Arab identity, what notions are these in terms of theory, in terms of ideas that you think about and write about? Your books are called, Desiring Arabs, for example. And there's books about the Arab world. So is the Arab world an Arab identity? Are they independent? Just tell us a little bit about that.
All right. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, Arab identity was formed like most national identities in the 19th century, mostly in the context of Ottoman rule under the Ottoman Empire, which pretty much ruled the majority of what is today the Arab world, perhaps with the exception of Morocco. But generally, of course, most Arab nationalist theorists have identified Arab identity as belonging to those who speak Arabic as their native tongue. So it was a linguistic category, not a racial or necessarily geographic. It was always a linguistic category, and therefore did not attend to any essentialist notions like European nationalisms did of race or of ethnicity of any sort. So Arabness really connotes mostly a linguistic category which became a national identity under the Ottomans, and especially in the late 19th and early 20th century in the face of European colonialism. Remember, the Arab world was colonized quite early. The first European invasion of Arab provinces was the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt and Syria, including Palestine. Napoleon, of course, was defeated in Palestine by a combined Ottoman and British force. The British, of course, saw the French as rivals and therefore aided in the defeat at the beginning of the 19th century. But then soon after, the French, of course, began a major invasion and a settler colonial project in Algeria in 1830. Then you also have a couple of more invasions of Egypt and Tunisia by the British and the French, respectively, in the early 1880s. But a lot of what becomes Arab identity begins, of course, also as a linguistic modernizing project in the 19th century, the modernization of the Arabic language, the creation of what is now called modern standard Arabic versus classical Arabic. Sometimes there's a sort of a misunderstanding among Orientalists or Western experts of Arabic, claiming that the modern Arabic of today is the same as the Arabic of the Quran. Of course, that's not true at all. The fact that modern Arabs who are educated can read the Quran and medieval documents with relative ease is not unlike how modern English-speaking people who are highly educated can read Chaucer and Marlowe and Shakespeare. But it's not the same, kind of language. There's a lot of modernization of syntax and vocabulary. A lot of that began in the 19th century, the creation of new dictionaries. But of course, Arab identity became highly politicized in the context of the increasing parochialization of the Ottomans in the late 19th century, when Arabic sort of increasingly became not an acceptable language for the Arab provinces. Turkish now began to be, a much more important. So you begin to see also a reaction to the demotion of Arabic, with the increasing presence of the Europeans. Even though many Arab countries were not yet occupied in the 19th century by the Europeans, the British and the Americans had begun kind of a very active missionary Protestant presence in Palestine, as would the Germans. So German fanatical evangelicals, as well as American fanatical evangelical Protestants, would begin to set up colonies, settler colonies, in Palestine in anticipation of the so-called second coming of Jesus Christ. So you begin to have small settler colonies of Americans in different parts of Palestine, as well as of Germans. These are German Protestants and also British Protestants. However, by the end of the 19th century, of course, the Zionist movement, the Jewish Zionist movement, which tries, in a way, continuing the Protestant Zionist movement. Much of what the British and the Protestants were doing in the 19th century, they came to call the Peaceful Crusade. It was not so peaceful, but also the fact that they called it a crusade harks back to the Crusades, of course, of the 11th century. So the reaction also begins to be one of understanding that this is actually a Protestant evangelical movement that initially sought to transform Arab Muslims to Protestantism. Failing that, they turned their attention to Arab Christians. Arab Christians, of course, especially in Syria and in Egypt, follow the Orthodox Arab churches, which would also be taken over by the Greeks, for example, subsequently. So increasingly, the loss of any kind of independence for political, religious, for Arab Christians certainly, but also the attempt to transform Islam into something Europe and European liberals can tolerate, especially in Algeria, where the French attempted to actually create a new Islam that would accord with the French ideology, would also create a major reaction. So you begin to see a very important transformation in Arab identity by the time you get to the World War I period. Arab Christians and Muslims were both very active in crafting sort of this new identity, which now transformed itself not only from a linguistic and cultural and also a political kind of sense of nationality into a strongly anti-colonial one, right? So this would manifest increasingly in the teens, 20s, and 30s. In the case of the Palestinians and the Syrians, against French, British, and Zionist colonial designs. In Egypt, against British designs, and in Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, against French colonial presence, and increasingly in places like Libya, against Italian colonialism. So you begin to see a sort of a movement across these provinces that had one goal, which is to liberate itself from the European colonial presence. And settler colonialism would be a very important aspect of this. The French, of course, would set up major settler colonies in Algeria. They would bring in tens of thousands, later hundreds of thousands of French, Italian, Spanish, and Maltese settlers into Algeria. Many also Italians and French would come to settle in Tunisia, and the Italians in Libya. During this, in the 19th century, of course, the French would commit the first major genocide in the Arab world. They would kill about 1 million Algerians through starvations and outside repression by 1870. The Italians would kill off 2/3 of the Italian population between 1911 and 1928, 1929. So you have sort of two major genocides in Arab countries, which also produced more reactions and revolutionary action against the European presence. So the current genocide against the Palestinians by Israel is really part of an important chain of events that begins in the 19th century and continues to the present.
Okay, so other than a language which you started from and which I think a lot of people think is the first form of an identity, a growing identity, not necessarily a nation, there's immense diversity in whatever we want to call it, whether it's the Arab world or an Arab identity. It's very, very diverse. And as you said also, the languages, the Arabic languages spoken are also very different, from Tunisia to Saudi Arabia to other parts.
Well, that's no more different than the English of Jamaica or New Zealand or rural Scotland.
Still different.
Versus England or the US. So yes, there are differing dialects, absolutely. But the notion of the Arab world is a British invention. The British invented the concept of something called the Arab world. The Middle East is even worse because, of course, the Middle East is in line with the European Eurocentrism, right? So basically, the Near East, what it used to be called, far and near to Europe, of course. So no one in the Middle East would call themselves a Middle Easterner, right? So the notion of a Middle East food or someone looking Middle Eastern is very foreign to the people who inhabit this colonially coded area called the Middle East. So generally they're Arabs, Turks, or Iranians, Muslims, which is a very strong identity, and Islam has been a very important identity also for Christian Arabs, right? So who feel themselves also Muslim culturally, but also having influenced Arab Islam in many ways, or especially Arab Orthodoxy. So in that sense, there's a huge sort of similarity and a kind of a commonality of fate under colonialism, but also during sort of the anti-Ottoman period of the late 19th century through World War I. So increasingly, of course, the British insisted, and the world powers after World War I, to divide different parts of the Arab world into different regions. The larger segment, of course, was in Syria, and in 1916, the British and the French and Russia's Tsar concluded a very important agreement, a secret agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, named after the British and the French foreign ministers, by which they divided Greater Syria, what becomes today's Syria and Lebanon, under French control, Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq under British control. And the idea was that Constantinople or Istanbul would go under Tsarist Russian control, so that the old Byzantium would be restored. Of course, Byzantium is a new term that the British invented in the second half of the 19th century. What we call Byzantium today was simply the Roman Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire, sometimes called. But as a result, of course, when the Russian Revolution took place, Lenin immediately came out, of course, and said, we have no interest whatsoever in Constantinople. Constantinople is a Muslim city and shall remain so. So that part of the deal, of course, was done, and the Russian Bolsheviks exposed the secret agreement and advertised it, which embarrassed the British and the French, given the lies that they had told to their Arab allies at the time, that they would grant independence to the region. So you begin to see these anti-colonial struggles going from Algeria to Tunisia to Egypt to Palestine to Syria to Iraq, in a concatenation, which in many ways would, and also of course in Morocco as well, after the French and Spanish sort of divided the country. So the anti-colonial aspect of modern Arab identity is very important. In the early 19th century, there was no Arab identity in the way we understand it today. Yeah. People would refer to someone being Ibn Arab, or a descendant of Arabs, but not necessarily an Arab. So Arab becomes an important term in the second half of the 19th century, and mostly in the first half of the 20th century. And then, of course, it would expand.
So if we talk about Arab identity before, say, this 6th October this year, although 6th October 1967 is also very important, but before...
73.
Yeah, 73.
Yeah.
Is very important. You could say that there is diversity, they read the same literature, there's a sense of an Arab identity. But 7th October changed a lot of things. And the Palestine we'll come to words that you've already used, genocide and settler colonialism. But what happened after the 7th of October, and which is continuing till today, and there seems to be no end to it. If you ask anybody what an Arab identity is, they'll identify Palestine as a center of that notion of identity. Whether others may sort of look away, but it's become central. I mean, the Palestinian question.
Absolutely. I mean, before I proceed to this, I want to mention also that, of course, Arabs are also unified, let's say, by their musical scales, by the access to Arabic literature. So in that sense, they do see their literary history and musical history as somehow unified, or that they derive their modern contemporary music from similar scales. So, for example, Egyptians and Moroccans don't have different musical scales or different poetic meters, let's say. So in that sense, yes, it's not only language, but also literature and music. Palestine would become also very important, because Palestine became important in the 19th century with the rise of fanatical evangelical Protestantism. And at the beginning of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, especially in Britain and Germany, two countries that were overtaken by this current of fanatical evangelical Protestantism. And as a result, Palestine became important. Remember, of course, Palestine is the birthplace of Christianity, and as a result, it would become important for European Christians and Jews, all of whom are converts to these two Palestinian religions, whether in the previous 2 millennia or a millennium and a half. Usually Palestinian Christians, my family is from a Palestinian Christian background, marvel at why Europeans would be Christian, because of course, for Palestinian or generally Syrian Christians, Christianity is a folk religion. People are actually from Bethlehem, from Nazareth, and from Jerusalem. So to believe in Christianity, if you're European, would be tantamount to a Palestinian Christian believing in Jesus being born in Paris, who grew up in London and was crucified in New York. So people actually marvel at how Europeans could actually believe in this Palestinian sort of folk religion, how very odd it is for them. But generally, so Palestine became very important for these European converts to Christianity in the sense that, as it had been for the Crusades, the idea that these converts realized that the geography from which their religion derived is a foreign geography, and they insisted that it was, of course, ruled by Muslims whom they considered heretics. Amazingly, of course, during the Crusades from the 11th century onwards, the majority of the Arabs, the Arabic-speaking people of Palestine were actually still Christian. It took about 5 centuries after the Arab-Muslim conquest for the majority of Palestinians to become Muslim. So during the Crusades, of course, the majority of those who were killed were Arab Christians because, of course, the Western Catholics thought of the Orthodox also as heretics, and the Orthodox, of course, were amazed at the heresy of Catholicism at the same time. So in this sense, you begin to see a very different approach to Palestine from Europe, again rising with Protestantism. And in the 19th century, the idea of the second coming of Jesus Christ for evangelical Christians becomes very important and intersects with the imperial project that Britain had at the time. So you begin to see more and more interest in the area. The British begin to insist on building even the first Protestant church in the Ottoman lands was built in Jerusalem in the 1840s after Ottoman rejection and refusal of this. So religion, missionary Protestantism, and British imperialism would coincide at the same time. So Palestine became important precisely for these ideological, religious, and imperial reasons. By the end of the 19th century, the failure of evangelical Protestantism to convert Palestine into a Protestant state, because part of the British plan was to actually expel European Jews, converting them to Christianity and sending them to Palestine so that they would actually accelerate the second coming of Jesus Christ. They were able to convert maybe 700 European Jews, but they failed to do more than that. In fact, the first evangelical Protestant bishop that they dispatched to Palestine to lead the church in the 1840s was a German Jewish rabbi who was converted to Protestantism, became a bishop, and then he was sent on a British frigate to Palestine to take over the Protestant mission there. So by the late 19th century, of course, Protestant Zionism transformed into Jewish Zionism, which kept Palestine very also important for the imperial project. So Palestine, as a result, became central, not only to the European colonial project, but also to Arab identity, which saw itself as extending, say, from Yemen to Morocco. So suddenly this project of transforming Palestine, which was geographically in the heart of that region, into a European colonial settler state, was going to divide the Arab world also geographically between its Asian and African parts. So Palestine would become central in that regard to Arab identity, and also because it was one of the 4 major settler colonies after Algeria, Libya, and Tunisia. And its struggle would continue. By the time we get to the early 1960s, when the Algerians were able to be triumphant finally in 1962 and end French settler colonialism, the sentiment in the Arab world was initially, before the fall of French Algeria, was that you still had 2 settler colonies, once Algeria was liberated in 1962, the idea was one down and one to go. So Palestine remained the last settler colony, if you will, as it does today, and therefore based on this sort of lineage of colonialism and European evangelical Christianity, coupled with imperialism, Palestine remained the fulcrum around which Palestinians and other Arabs would congregate. We saw this clearly during the so-called Arab Spring, in that many of the populations who revolted against various Arab regimes were also fully supportive of the Palestinians and saw their regimes as being somehow collaborating with imperial plans and with Israel, and therefore this would continue. We've seen in the last 5 months, for example, huge amounts of demonstrations across the Arab world, if not also the Muslim world, in support of Palestine, based on this understanding and this lineage of colonial sort of infiltration of Arab and Muslim lands. And I should say that in the forefront of those who defend Palestine and Arab nationalism is a multi-confessional population of Arab Christians and Muslims. So it's a unifying factor. I know in some areas or in some intellectual circles, perhaps in certain Muslim countries, whether in Pakistan or in Turkey or elsewhere, the fact that many Islamists support Palestine has perhaps transformed it also into an Islamist question, which made some of the anti-colonial erstwhile secularists uncomfortable with this approach. Palestine had always been a secular issue. Zionism was always a religious issue, whether it's in its Protestant or in a Jewish variety. The Palestinian national movement remained secular in its majority until the late 1980s, and only then, with the transformation of the Muslim world and the rise of religious sentiment across the world, whether it's in amongst Hindus in India, amongst evangelical Christians in the US, amongst Jews also in Israel. Also, you begin to see in Palestine the rise also of liberation movements that were also committed to an Islamist identity, but not necessarily sectarian. I mean, Hamas certainly is not sectarian. It has always made sure to defend Palestinian Christians. There has been attempts to produce it as sectarian that has not been actually successful.
I'll intervene here because I've never met anyone, at least in Pakistan or anywhere, who thinks that Palestine or Palestinian struggle is an Islamist project. Everyone that who talks about Palestine talks about a secular, the PLA, the earlier PLA, the 1960s and so on, the Yasser Arafati, right? It's never been an Islamist or Islamicist project. But there's always been an Arab war or an Arab identity or a Muslim identity. And Muslim and Islam are often sort of disaggregated for different reasons. So there's been a support for Muslims fighting against Zionism, fighting against the Jews, but never been sort of the
against Zionist Jews only, not against
Zionist Jews, not against all Jews, but it's the Israeli state, the Israel state and Zionism, Zionist Jews. So I've never seen anybody who says that this is a war for Islam against this thing.
Right.
It's Muslims, which is very different. So there's a slight difference from.
Well, I mean, some Islamists might say that, but Hamas doesn't say that. Hamas does say this is a national liberation war, as does Islamic
as
Jihad.
a nation or as a religion?
As a nation. Remember, actually, Hamas began in the late 1980s as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, because in the early 1980s, the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a transnational organization, refused to make Palestine a central issue. So the first sort of Islamist group amongst Palestinians was Islamic Jihad, who begins in 1981. It sort of breaks with the Muslim Brotherhood because for it, Palestine was an important sort of issue. Then by the late 1987-88, Hamas rises from within the Muslim Brotherhood, but as a separate Palestinian organization now, committed to liberation, and for which, as a group, Palestine was central as a national liberation issue, but also with religious connotations. Mm-hmm. And this, of course, increased with the increasing religious rhetoric of the Zionists and of the Israelis, who insist that God had promised them this land, so that there's an objection to God being a real estate agent in this regard, and a different kind of understanding of settler colonialism, right? And remember, of course, the Zionists are not original thinkers. So the Italians and the French, when they colonized Algeria, Tunisia, and Italy, would always claim that they were actually the heirs to the Roman Empire, and that they were returning to the provinces of the Roman Empire in North Africa, and that the Arabs and the Muslims there are the real colonists. So when the Italians and the French arrived, they claimed to be coming back home, and that the Arabs themselves were the colonists. So when the Zionists also claim that European Jews are allegedly returning to Palestine, and the Palestinian Arabs are the real colonists, it's not an original idea. They actually get it from the French and from the Italian colonialists in that regard. Zionism may be many things. Original it is not in its arguments.
So Professor Massad has written 4 books and dozens of articles. But so it'll be a grave injustice if I say that you should read at least one of his articles, which was published on the 8th of October. You'll find it online. It's called Just Another Battle, or the Palestinian War of Liberation. This is what happened after the 7th of October. So you write in that article, and I think it's a very powerful article. In about 8 days, he got 47,000 signatures from Columbia University, where he teaches, where people said he should be dismissed. There was a death threat.
Not from Columbia University, from Americans.
From around New York. And
the U.S.
And the U.S. Yeah. And then that became 80,000 death letters to dismiss you and so on and so forth. So it's obviously a powerful article which resonated with those who don't even agree. So you write in that, I think it's particularly powerful because after what happened, and it's also celebratory in some ways. It's, you write that millions of jubilant Arabs watched the news, and they were in awe at what's happened, this great Israeli state, which was supposed to be, impassable, where the military was supposed to be the best in the world, and so on and so forth. And here, as you write, individuals on paragliders came across, and then the events that happened.
Well, the jubilation in the Arab world is that 2.3 million people who were living in a concentration camp since 2005 were able to break the walls and the gates of that concentration camp and attack the military bases of Israel around Gaza and capture Israeli soldiers. I wrote this within the first 12 hours of the operation. And also they were able to get into some of the Jewish settler colonies surrounding Gaza as well. So for many Arabs and many Israelis, this was an incredible event. Yeah. No one was, people were not, were in disbelief that this was actually in many ways unfolding before their eyes. So in that sense, it's a historic event, as Israelis and Arabs, of course, recognized, mostly because, of course, Israel has terrorized the Arab world for 75 years. It has invaded, upwards of, all of its neighbors and bombed several of its distant neighbors. It has bombed Iraq and Tunisia and Sudan, invaded Egypt several times, it invaded Syria and Lebanon several times, and Jordan. So we're speaking about a country that has been a major aggressor, that has destabilized the region, created a huge amount of tragedies, and left a tail of dead bodies in its wake ever since it arrived on the scene as a settler colony, which of course is supported by the European colonial countries and the European white settler colonies, the US, New Zealand, Australia, historically South Africa under apartheid, Canada. All these countries have always and continue, of course, to vote with Israel and to support its genocidal war today. So 80,000 Americans signed a letter to dismiss me from my job because I'm against genocide and for the liberation of people from occupation and concentration camps. You did not find 80,000 Americans to sign a letter against genocide, for example. So it gives you an idea about the dominant political culture in the US or in the West, more generally.
So something we write in that article, which is particularly pertinent, is that you write that this is the first time the Palestinians or any other Arab army have launched an all-out war inside the 1948 Israeli territories, which is extraordinary itself.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which gives you a sense of the scale. I mean, there have been other incidents, events outside of Israel, but nothing this large.
Most of the wars were either in
Jordan or Syria,
or in yet unoccupied Palestinian territories like the West Bank and Gaza in '67, or the '73 war, which Israel misrepresents as an attack on Israel. It was actually the Egyptian and the Syrian armies attacking the Israeli occupation army in the occupied Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula. So they didn't actually attack Israel proper. So this is the first time that you actually have an engagement with the Israeli army inside the borders of Israel in 1948, since the War of 1948. So this was, again, a historic event for Israelis and for Arabs and Palestinians at large.
So you rightly mentioned the colonial history, but today in this imperial world or neo-imperialism, Israel couldn't exist the way it does if it was not protected by a large number of countries who support Israel, and they take the right away of Palestinians to be in their own free home, but they grant Israel that right. So Israel is not simply, so the question then arises is whether it's simply Zionism, the Israeli state, or is prejudice and genocide taking place within Israel. But without, this could not happen without the full support, ammunitions, arms, and the ideological, diplomatic support by a few handful of countries. So it's not just an Israeli genocide. It goes well beyond that.
Well, it's more than that. I mean, Israel could not survive militarily for one day, clearly.
Or economically, without
but I mean, the fact that the Americans had to send their warships immediately within a few hours of the attack tells you that even a weak third world country could have been able to defend itself. That Israel, with its mighty army and its nuclear weapons, could not defend itself against Palestinian sort of militias or liberation force that has been living under a horrific surveillance in a concentration camp for the last 2 decades, gives you an idea about this sort of hoopla about the Israelis being stronger than they actually are. I mean, the Israelis, of course, are very, very strong in murdering civilians, as we could see. They could decimate civilian areas. They have killed upwards of 30,000 people and so far injured over 70,000 and displaced upwards of 2 million people. Their war against civilians is always a triumphant war, but clearly they have not been able to dislodge even a very sort of makeshift Palestinian guerrilla movement that is trying to liberate itself from the Israeli occupation. So you're right. There's not only the Israeli settler colony exists because of a strong racist but also religious evangelical sense that Europeans and American Christians have, that somehow, and they're committed to. Remember, I mean, British prime ministers historically, even American presidents historically, have been also evangelical Christians. I mean, President Carter was a born-again Christian. Reagan was a born-again Christian. The Bushes were born-again Christians. We're not speaking about secular countries, right? I mean, the U.S., since Eisenhower, had become a very Christian country. Eisenhower insisted on being baptized in office at the White House. He insisted on printing "In God We Trust" on American money, on adding, for example, the word "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, where they would say, one nation under God. Right, where they have a national prayer breakfast. This is a very Christian country. Its politicians are very Christian and very Protestant and evangelical. We hear stories from Biden, or even from Clinton, who tell us that they grew up and their pastors told them to make sure they protect Israel. So there is a strong evangelical, ideological sense, which of course is also very anti-Muslim and anti-Eastern Christianity in that sense. So Arab Christians also, or Palestinian Christians, are dismissed in this ideological aspect of it. But also there's the imperial aspect, that Israel has rendered a lot of military and political services to the US. In addition to that, of course, there's this false sense of guilt that European Christians who have murdered 6 million Jews during World War II as a result of their anti-Semitism think they can mitigate their guilt today by supporting the genocide of the Palestinians. Perhaps Germany is the guiltiest party of all. Germany, of course, I mean, I prefer to call it the Fourth Reich, is a country that is so committed to the genocide of the Palestinians and to support Israel in killing Palestinians as a way of alleviating what it calls its guilt, a guilt that, of which, of course, it is, absolutely should feel, and it is absolutely guilty of the horrific murder of 6 million Jews. But instead of learning the lesson of genocide as something not to be repeated, it feels impelled to support more, and not only unified Germany, but also West Germany since the 1950s has been a major supporter of Israel militarily and economically, and an enemy of the Palestinian people, along with Britain, France, and the United States. One of the things also that Israel uses very effectively is that it claims that Palestinians attack Israel or Israeli Jews because they're Jews, not because they're colonists, as if Muslims or Christians or Hindus had colonized Palestine, the Palestinians would have welcomed them and said, oh, we love you. The only reason why we attack Israelis is because they're Jews. Of course, Palestinians only attack Israelis because they're colonists, not because they're Jews. But Israel will not win that argument. So it tries to conflate its colonial history with European Jewish history. The opposition to its colonial history becomes equated with the anti-Semitic European Christian history against European Jews, as if Israel is a victim of anti-Semitism, when in fact it's simply, the Palestinians are the victims of its colonialism, and they resist it because it's a colonial country. So you begin to hear in the Western media after the 7th of October prison breakout by the Palestinians that this is the largest number of Jews killed since the Holocaust. It's an appalling, of course, comparison, because these Israelis were killed for being colonists, for stealing someone else's land. They were not killed because they were Jews. And of course, it's anti-Semitic to claim that Israel represents Jews. Israel only represents Israelis. It does not represent Jews. Historically, it did not get the support of the majority of Jews. And even if today non-Israeli Jews may support Israel, Israel does not represent them. So the idea Israel wants to speak of itself as a country whose achievements are Jewish achievements and whose wars and victories are Jewish wars and Jewish victories. That is utterly anti-Semitic, right? Israeli crimes are the crimes of the Israeli government, not of the Jewish people. Israeli wars are the wars of the Israeli government. And Palestinians oppose the Israeli government and its settlers who support this genocide, not because they're Jews, but because they are settlers, they're colonists, and because it's a genocidal country.
So you also talk about the love affair of the autocratic rulers, authoritarian rulers in the Arab world, the leaders and rulers who have with Israel. And so for many of us, we think that of course it's got the new imperial protection, the military might and all that. But even in the region, even around its neighborhood, there are regimes who have said that, it doesn't matter, we'll make friends with Israel. Israel is more important because they've got drone technology or IT technology or they have big markets and so on and so forth. So you have these autocratic authoritarian regimes, Arab regimes, who are in some ways protecting Israel, not perhaps the way the others that you've named, the Americans and the others, but they're also part of the problem.
No, very much so, but also because all these autocratic Arab regimes are agents of the U.S. So they're imperial agents, and therefore it has been made clear to them that their sort of good relations with the White House pass through Israel. So you begin to see this in the 1970s. Initially, Anwar Sadat claimed, and perhaps correctly, that our war with Israel is not really with Israel, it's a war with the U.S. And we cannot defeat the United States, and therefore, instead of actually turning to the world fora to actually put the U.S. on notice for sponsoring Israeli settler colonialism, he decided to make peace with Israel. And of course, it's become very clear, not only to Arabs and Palestinians, but to the rest of the world, as soon as 7th October happened, that this war is also a war with the U.S., that what the Palestinians are fighting are the American forces. The Americans have just today also are sending more and more arms to Israel. Israel is financed by them. Not only is it provided for militarily by the Americans, American advisors are on the ground. American personnel and intelligence drones fly over Gaza. American generals are collaborating with Israeli generals in their war strategy since the beginning of the war, as have the Brits, as have the French and the Germans. They are actually shameless. They're standing against the international consensus. In December, over 153 countries at the United Nations passed a resolution in the General Assembly calling for an immediate ceasefire. The only opponents of the ceasefire, again, were the white supremacist countries of the US, France, Britain, Germany, and the rest of the settler colonies. When the International Court of Justice decided that the case brought by South Africa against Israel as a genocidal country is a plausible case, 14 of the 15 permanent judges on the ICJ supported all these provisions, which shows you actually an international consensus. However, when the US speaks of an international consensus, it means it's a consensus among the white supremacist countries who decide what should happen in the world. But the majority of the world, at least population-wise, whether it's from China to Russia to Brazil to Pakistan and Malaysia and Indonesia and South Africa, outnumber the white supremacist states, but they are not considered, the international consensus.
But you have Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco.
They voted for a ceasefire, even though
ceasefire is very different from.
Even though behind closed doors, or in the case of other countries like the UAE or even Saudi Arabia, they pursue friendly relations with the Israelis. Again, the idea is that the Palestinians are a nuisance. Let's get rid of them. Israel is here to stay. This is the kind of if you will, a kind of defeatist line that these countries have used. And they rewrite the history that, for example, Arab countries had lost a lot of money or perhaps fought wars on behalf of the Palestinians. That's not actually true. So only in 1948 did some Arab countries intervene to safeguard the United Nations mandated Palestinian state from falling into the hands of the Zionists. But they did so for hegemonic reasons. Iraq and Jordan, two Hashemite monarchies, were concerned about Egypt at the time under King Farouk. King Farouk was concerned about them. They wanted to establish the leadership over the Arab world in the late 1940s. But since then, it was Israel who actually invaded Egypt in 1956. It invaded Egypt again in 1967, and Jordan and Syria. So these countries defended themselves. They were not actually launching wars to defend the Palestinians. In 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a war to retrieve their own occupied territories, the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, not to liberate Palestine. In 1978 and 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to decimate the Palestinian resistance at the time. And that was the first time that the United Nations called Israel's war on Lebanon and the massacres genocide. That was an act of genocide. So you begin to see also this vocabulary beginning to be used since the 1980s. But then you have, some Arab governments who are close to Israel today claiming that they fought Israel for the sake of the Palestinians, but that they lost. It's not actually true. They fought for their own countries and their own populations, not for Palestine. But of course, the Palestine Liberation Organization did make a huge mistake in the late 60s, early 70s, when it insisted that the war, or the anti-colonial war in Palestine was just a Palestinian affair. The Palestinians wanted a kind of independence from Arab decision-making, but in doing so, they helped the Arab regimes wash their hands off the entire affair. When in fact, Israel has been, since 1948, a country that endangers all Arab countries. Israel used to bomb Lebanon.
Yet they're lapping it up. I mean, the opening embassy, they were until the 6th of October, 7th of October.
Yes, of course. The Saudis are disappointed Yeah,
Absolutely
they're a bit disappointed that their plan to normalize with Israel is now in trouble. I suspect after the war they'll try to resume it, but it has to be under a new cover. I mean, today they are collaborating with the Americans and the Europeans to fashion a new a new Palestinian leadership. That would be a collaborator leadership, like the one you already have in the West Bank, to collaborate with the Israelis and with the Americans into creating a kind of a Bantustan solution, like the one, for example, Gacha Buthelezi had under apartheid in South Africa, but they would call this an independent Palestinian state. You have now a whole class of Palestinian collaborators who have been collaborating with Israel since 1993 for the express purpose of becoming sort of the local heads of these Bantustans, which they would, dub a Palestinian independent state. But that's not really what is happening. On the contrary, they're trying to revive some other Palestinian leaders in the hope that the discredited Abbas would not continue to be discredited. But anyone who would accept this position will be discredited immediately after, because the only solution to settler colonialism and to Israel as a Jewish supremacist racist country with a battery of racist laws is to completely abrogate these laws, is to undo settler colonialism, to equate people and give them equality. I mean, the most horrific fate for white or European colonial settlers in Algeria or Tunisia or Libya, or for Jewish colonial settlers in Palestine, the worst fate, it's a fate worse than death, is to become equal to the natives. So if you offer them as, a resolution to the violence as a way of ending the anti-colonial war, by ending colonialism and by ending racism, they are absolutely horrified. So the response is, oh my God, you want to destroy Israel. Yes, there is a call to destroy Israel's racist laws, Israel as a racist country based on racist premises and on colonialism, and as a call for equality amongst the entire population. The call for equality is interpreted or coded in the pro-genocidal West and the pro-genocidal Israel as a call to kill Jews rather than to be equal to them.
I'm going to stop because I want to open it up for some questions and we can go back.
Sure.
So whoever has a mic. You do talk about Israeli apartheid and you use that term in your article.
First of all, I would disagree with Dr. Zaidi. Israel and the Jews is a term that's used interchangeably by the clergy in Pakistan. Not just the clergy, but also Islamic political parties. And it is a very convenient red herring. So it's very conveniently used to draw attention away from their own failings. So it's not something that's looked at it politically only. The other thing is, I want to ask a question. How do you see Gaza? What is going to be the end game there to the present conflict?
Thank you. First of all, I should say that, of course, Israel does not distinguish between Zionists and Jews. Israel calls itself the Jewish state. It says it has the right to kill Palestinians in the name of Jews. It has the right to attack them in the name of Jews. So Israel really is the anti-Semitic party here that conflates what it does with all Jews and makes them bear the responsibility for its crimes and wars. So it is it is the Zionists who've always wanted to conflate themselves with all Jews, even though the majority of Jews in the world do not live in Israel and are not colonists. I'm unable to predict what's going on in Gaza beyond the ongoing genocide and the machinations that are going on in Washington and today in Germany with a security meeting between some Arab governments and the Palestinian Collaborator Authority with the Americans and the Europeans. They're unable to defeat Hamas, clearly. 4 months into this war, the horrible destruction and this genocidal war has not been able to defeat Hamas. The Israelis are at a loss This is, and remember, according to Israeli polls, over 98% of the Jewish public in Israel thinks that the Israeli government is not using enough firepower against the Palestinians. So we're speaking about a genocidal political culture in Israel itself. That this is not just a genocidal government, but also a genocidal electorate that supports genocide. So I think so far it all will depend on what the resistance is able to do and what it will achieve. The ongoing collaboration of several Arab governments with whatever American plan is unfolding continues, but the outcome is not guaranteed. And even if Hamas is defeated, the issue will not go away. I mean, the fact that Israel continues to exist as a racist, apartheid, genocidal state will not go away. Whatever they create in the West Bank and Gaza as a new form of Bantustans, not unlike what existed in the last 30 years, will not change that, right? People will never accept to continue to be ruled by this genocidal racist state. So the calls for ending Israeli genocide, Israeli apartheid, to abrogate the more than 65 racist laws in Israel will continue. The expectation on the part of the Americans and their Arab allies is that they can neutralize this issue by creating another version of the Bantustan that they will call a Palestinian state, and then they can recognize that as a Palestinian state. But that's not going to be, I mean, remember, apartheid South Africa was the only country who recognized all the Bantustans that it set up for black people as separate states. So this is an already, tired kind of strategy. But the Americans and the Israelis always have short-term tactics. Their strategy isn't only having short-term tactics. This has worked for them. The Israelis do not want what they call a long-term solution. A long-term solution would always mean the dismantlement of Israeli apartheid and racist laws. So Israel has been able to live for the last 75 years with short-term tactics. Whenever you have Palestinian resistance, you bomb them, kill thousands of people. It has already killed upwards of 140,000 people since World War II, since 1948 until now. What's another 100,000 people for the Israelis? This is generally their logic. As a settler colonial state, they understand that they can only survive in that mode. The problem is that unlike the surviving colonial settler states in the world, Jews are no longer a majority in Palestine, Israel. Israel made them a majority in 1948 when it successfully ethnically cleansed the country by expelling close to 1 million Palestinians. But today, Israeli Jews are less than 47% of the population of the areas that Israel controls, and they're getting less and less. The only surviving white settler colonies are the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, where white people have managed to erase the majority of natives and indigenous populations, even though, of course, all these people, the Native Americans, First Nations in Canada, the Aborigines of Australia, and the Maoris in New Zealand continue to resist today because encroachment on their lands and on their rights continues. But these white settler colonies continue to survive because they've established great white settler majorities. Israel has failed to do this.
We have 5 minutes, so we need a couple of more questions.
All right, so I'll stop.
So that people can
First of all, thank you so much, Professor Massad, for all your work. There are many professors at Columbia who talk about Palestine, but Columbia is a relatively, one could call it perhaps a conservative university in many ways. But nobody that I know at Columbia talks about it in such a no-holds-barred and radical way as you do. Your quote in December, when you said that you don't speak truth to power, power already knows the truth, and you speak truth to the people, because power actually invests a lot, whether in corporation or in universities, in stopping people from knowing the truth. So thank you very much for that. It's a motto for so many people, so many movements, your statement. The question to you is, what percentage, one imagines that even though Palestine is a core part of Arab identity, but one still imagines that there are still Arabs who now probably think that 70 years on, Palestine is a lost cause, and they would be fatigued, and what percentage of people would be alienated from the Palestinian struggles among the Arab countries? And my other question is for the moderator, Professor Akbar Zaidi. February 2020, as a political economist at McGill University, somebody asked you, South Asian students asked you whether Pakistan should, can and should recognize Israel. And you appear to think that there wouldn't be any, that you don't really see any real reason why it shouldn't, except for, the public, the move being unpopular with the public. Do you still think that? It's interesting to see you at a Palestine panel now, so it would be interesting to see your view, hear your views as a political economist about whether or not Pakistan should recognize Israel.
You have a second question there as well.
Sir, I would like to ask the questions. As we have seen by the political history, Israel has not accepted both Palestinians and Hamas and the PLO on the West Bank. They have not accepted from their core of the heart as authority after becoming the authority, and there was a diplomatic efforts by United Nations. So I don't think so Israel will accept Palestine, the people who are doing a struggle, political, diplomatic struggle to make an independent state as a Palestine. If they are not accepting as authority, they are not accepting last 17 years for their power of self-sovereignty. So I don't think this is the international conspiracy against the Arab Muslims. This is the international conspiracy against the Arabs, Arab identity. My question is that if the Muslim leadership, Arab leadership have been fighting for the Palestinian independent state, this is also going to be a big international conspiracy against the Palestinians, because they want to kill every Palestinian.
That's not a question. Thank you.
They want to kill every Palestinian over there.
Yeah, that's exactly what he's been saying. So could you respond to
All right.
this
Yes,
one and then we'll go there.
Thank you very much for your kind words. Remember, there has been huge anti-Palestinian propaganda, for example, beginning under Sadat in Egypt, and then subsequently by many of the normalizing regimes in the Arab world that have become friends with Israel, trying to malign the Palestinians. Despite that, amazingly, even, for example, in Saudi Arabia, as a result of the recent genocidal war against the Palestinians, the amazing amount of boycott of American companies. McDonald's has been abandoned, for example, across the Arab world, from rural Egypt to across Jordan, Saudi Arabia. Starbucks, all these American businesses have been boycotted by people who may be scared in voicing their opinions in countries that are dictatorial, but they are actually voting with their feet, for example, in boycotting American businesses. So you see, despite a huge amount of propaganda for the last 40 years against the Palestinians in a number of Arabic countries, and increasingly in the Arab transnational press, usually controlled by Gulf countries that are friendly to Israel, the support for the Palestinians remains very, very strong, evidenced by demonstrations across, from Morocco all the way to Yemen, who has, of course, joined the war on behalf of the Palestinians, as has Lebanon.
So I can answer your question later, because I think Professor Massad is here, best to ask him. I'll certainly answer your question. So you have the mic.
Thank you. I was wondering, it was very...
we
I
are
can't
almost
see
out
you.
of
Yeah.
Can you stand?
He's in the second row.
Yeah.
So we're almost out of time where they're telling us. So quickly, just a short question.
I just want to say a few things about... we have talked about Israel and the Western prejudices and their bias against the so-called Muslims. But on the other hand, what we are seeing that despite having 59 countries, so-called Muslim countries, and before that there was Arab nationalism, and then the Islamic nationalism, both strategies have failed to work in favor of any of the Muslim or Arab causes, number one. And number two, do you think that in Israel, in the Palestinian strategy, right from Al-Fatah and maybe Hosseini's time to this time, they have adopted a militancy as a tool to succeed? Has it been the one of the major reason for their being crushed by the world powers, and
So
even
the control
Israel
time is up.
giving an escape or giving an opportunity to crush them?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We've been told time's up. So I'd just like to sort of remind everybody that Professor Massad is giving the keynote tomorrow evening as well, where he'll be talking about some of the ideas here. He's available if you want to ask him. So the organizer said the time is up. So thank you. Please join me in thanking Professor Joseph Massad for being here. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and I thank the Karachi Literary Festival for inviting me to speak today and tomorrow. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. This is a very important and very relevant discussion to have. So thank you for your insight and everyone for attending.